Hi, my name is Andrew Abramson, and in this video, I'll be discussing some of the research I've done for my thesis called Printing Money, Spending It, and Diagnosing Inflation, a comparative analysis of the mainstream and post-Keynesian approaches. So we have a lot of issues as a country and as an economy. We need to spend money to solve the climate crisis, to increase funding for public education and transportation, for childcare, racial justice, and so many more issues. And yet we're constantly being told that we can't fund these priorities because of ever-rising government debt and deficits and ever-rising prices because of soaring historic inflation. And these issues, we're told, are what prevent us from solving our economic priorities. But there are a lot of economic schools of thought that can help us solve these issues. I decided to look at the mainstream approach and the post-Keynesian approach. So I wanted to see how each approach explains money and inflation, like the causes of inflation, how to mitigate it, and how to prevent it. And I want to see which one holds up better in our economy and which can better solve our economic issues. So in terms of government spending, the mainstream approach sees it as dangerous if there's too much federal debt and too much deficit spending, because the mainstream believes that in the future, generations after us will have to pay money back to the government in the form of taxes to help us finance our current government deficits. Debt is bad, according to the mainstream. The post-Keynesians take a different approach and see government debt and deficits as not that much of a problem, because they believe that the government, the US government at least, can't go into debt on its own currency. The US prints the dollar, so it can't go into debt on the dollar. So when the government spends more than it gets in taxes, it can really just print more money to fund the deficit. And that will not have any future problems. One risk, though, may be inflation. So the mainstream approach, and when I say mainstream, I'm referring to the neoclassical or monetarist economic approaches, defines money as a medium of exchange, a unit of value, and a unit of account and a store of value. So what this means is the mainstream basically sees money as simply something that you can use to buy something. You take a piece of paper and you exchange it for a good, and that is what money is. And they see inflation as a purely monetary phenomenon. So basically, if there's more money in the economy, then inflation goes up. If I give everyone $1 million right now, prices are going to rise. The post-Keynesian approach, and when I say post-Keynesian, I'm referring to the modern monetary theory tradition within post-Keynesianism. Post-Keynesians believe that money is more of a promise or an obligation, a representation of future production, which means that money isn't just something that I can exchange for a good. It's something that actually predicts what goods will be produced in the future. So if I give my money to a gas station employee, that money might end up taking the form of a wage, and that wage might end up becoming the startup funds for a business owner who might end up producing something brand new at a brand new business in the future. And for post-Keynesians, inflation is a measure of how much we are using our physical resources. So if I try to produce more things than I have the ability to produce in the economy, then that might cause inflation, according to post-Keynesians. So to do my analysis, I went to the data. I looked at the Federal Reserve Board of St. Louis, and I collected a lot of different variables. I took those variables and I basically categorized them based on which approach finds them most important. So as I discussed on the previous slide here, the schools of thought think of inflation differently. The mainstream believes that money itself is going to cause inflation. So if we grow the amount of money in the economy, we might cause inflation. Post-Keynesians believe that if we push past the total amount of production that we're able to, we're going to cause inflation. So I've categorized these variables. And as you can see, the mainstream approach and the post-Keynesian approach both have the unemployment rate in them. While the unemployment rate might present itself differently in each of the approaches, both approaches do see the unemployment rate as causing inflation. And it's important to note that within my argument, I do discuss how the lines are a little bit blurred, and both schools of thought do look at both variables often, at all sets of variables often to determine what might cause inflation. But the core of each argument does see these variables as causing inflation. So I took this data and I put it into two different regression models. First, a simple regression, where I basically took the logarithm of both variables in my regression equations. So if you look at the table on the left, I used a log-log regression model, which meant that I used inflation as a dependent variable and each of the other variables in my table as the independent variables in several regression equations. I also used a slightly more complex regression model called a vector autoregression model. And this is a little bit different because rather than imposing that the dependent variable is inflation, this model takes every single variable at the same time. It looks at its past values and its future values and sees the effect of the past on the future. And also it changes which variable is the dependent variable in each time that it runs. So I used a recursive VAR model to do this. So which approach is better? I needed to think of some criteria to figure this out. So I wanted to look at which variables show statistical significance in the simple regression analysis, which show statistical significance in the vector autoregression analysis with lagged variables, which means including variables from past time periods to predict future outcomes. I wanted to see which ones have non-zero impacts on future inflation and which variables and how strongly those variables actually impact inflation. So as you can see, I ended up with more statistically significant variables on the post-Keynesian side of the table. But it's important to note that both sides of the table, both the mainstream and the post-Keynesian sides have significant factors that affect inflation. So some important takeaways is that capacity utilization, a 1% increase in capacity utilization causes a 12.27% increase in inflation. That's significant. And the VAR model with one lag variable, meaning looking back one time period at the effect in the future, the money supply growth actually does cause inflation. And when you look at how much each of these variables actually affects future inflation, you can see that the money supply growth accounts for 10.25% of future inflation, capacity utilization accounts for 5.17%, and corporate profits 12.27% of future inflation. So the key takeaways here is that we can maintain full employment and fund essential priorities without massive inflation. It's not just about the money supply, a lot of other factors come into play. The Federal Reserve does have a dual mandate and to maintain manageable inflation and full employment, but these are not mutually exclusive according to the post-Keynesians and according to the statistically significant variables that I found. Simply printing money is something that we're really scared to do to solve our problems, but in reality, it doesn't have as much of an effect on inflation as we've been led to believe. We can expand our productive capacity without causing inflation, and we can fund our priorities as long as we're not pushing past what we think our productive capacity is. So we really can fund our most important economic priorities without causing inflation as long as we look at all of the variables. Thank you so much for watching and have a great day.